You're all welcome to, if you'd like, turn your video on. It's up to you. We'll leave audio off for a little bit if you don't mind. Once we get into our dialogue here, we're just welcoming folks in as they join us. So, Bob Mosher.
Con Godfredson.
It is great to have you all here. Greetings from the U.S. nation's capital. Con and I are visiting Washington, D.C. for the next 3 days. Our second business trip.
Yeah.
Since March of 2020. How crazy, right? We really hope that wherever in the world you are coming to us from, that you are safe and well, family and friends and in all this craziness. It is good to have you here.
And we're just across from the White House, so that if they need help on workflow learning, we're here.
We are a phone call away.
We just skip right over there.
So here's what we're going to do, friends, with our quarterly webinars this year. We are so appreciative that you took the time to invest in the podcast. This is the Learning versus Training theme webinar. It's interesting calling it a webinar because we're going to try a different format, friends, than a traditional, at least what you may think of as a traditional webinar. No slides, no PowerPoints. You got sort of the backstory through either the blog if you read that, or the podcast if you listened to Con and I yammering. But we want to use this as a time to extend that conversation. We gave you some questions to think about. We'd love to hear your reaction to things and how you're doing in the world of workflow 5 moments, training versus learning, and let you ask questions, make comments, share examples of challenges, successes, not so great stuff, good, bad, and ugly. Those are all completely acceptable in the next 40 minutes or so while we have this time. So love to hear your feedback and how you think this format goes, but we really want to give a way to extend into the workflow. How's that? Your thoughts and ideas and more of our thinking around the topics throughout the year. So we will do these quarterly. This is the first. There'll be another one next quarter. Love to hear your ideas for what the themes might be helpful. Of course, we'll continue to podcast and blog. And based on popularity and input from you folks, we will pivot our dialogue off of that. Okay, ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so friends, let's get into this learning versus training. Let's recap, Con. Let's kind of go back into the what drove us to that theme for that particular podcast.
Well, we've been on a journey in our profession, haven't we? All of us. The first conference that you and I went to was a computer training and support conference in like 1990. Elliot Macy had put it together, and training, was a noble way of doing work. It was wonderful. And then we made this transition somehow. No, it's not about training, it's about learning. So we became, instead of training organizations, learning organizations.
Learning and development.
Learning and development. But in reality, it's not versus. There's this dance that we have to do with learners. There are things that we do that are training. There's methodology that we employ. We do things to facilitate learning. That's the training side. And then we have the learning side, and we have to focus in on that and help learners learn how to learn and enable that learning. People don't just show up to an event or an experience and just learn.
Right.
They have to engage themselves.
But I think one thing that we were trying to get to, guys, and we'd love your feedback on this, is that in changing the brand, a couple things I would think we argue about is that we may not have changed the methodology, though.
Oh.
We kind of stayed mired in training as our deliverable, even though we might have rebranded ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think secondly, and I love this, something kind of heard you say before, is training is what we do. Learning is what the learner owns.
Right.
Right. And so calling ourselves a learning and development department might be a bit misleading, because our feeling is that the learning is we don't do learning to our learners. Right. We facilitate it. We'll talk a little bit about that today. And I think we have to challenge and change the methodology a bit and the deliverables a bit, but we aren't really the learning department. We own the training side and performance support, as we'd argue, but learning is there job.
Yeah, and learning has had a narrow interpretation, I think, in our profession, which is all about knowledge, and getting knowledge and having it stick, and maybe some skills along the way. But the assumption often is if you understand, you can do.
Yes.
And so we go into these models, these instructional models that are very knowledge centric.
Yep.
Rather than performance centric.
Yep.
We want effective performance in the workflow, and that requires knowledge, but knowledge is not the end. Knowledge enables performance, and there are things that have to be done to ensure that people can perform effectively.
And team, do this for us in chat. Would you mind? How many of you have heard our spiel on train, transfer, sustain? Could you give me that in chat if you've heard that, or you can raise your hand, I think, at the bottom.
Yep.
Yep. Brian.
Right.
Good for you. Beth, see your hand up. Heather, no. David, yes. Just watching in the chat. Oh, no. And then, okay, so let's just quick recap. And I think this is the challenge that we're trying to drive us towards in this learning versus training thing, friends, is that train, transfer, sustain is the journey the learner is on, right? They have, and to Khan's point a moment ago, they have to get trained up. We get that. There's knowledge to be gained. There's practice to be done. We get all that. But the reality is they then have to move into the world of transfer, right? We call that first journey of train mastery, as in to master the knowledge. Frankly, they haven't proven that they've mastered the task. They may practice in class. We may put them through assessments, simulations. I'm not discrediting those. But friends, I think we'd all argue, those are not the workflow. The workflow in the real world of work is very different than anything we can possibly simulate. So they go to transfer, and here's where Con and I are trying to challenge us a bit here, is that's where I know I used to say my job ended. As an L&D professional, when they moved from train to transfer, my job ended at the door, be it digital or real life, right? And so now they're out in this world of churn. They're trying to make the cognitive contextual jump from knowing and practicing and hands-on and testing to working.
Yeah.
And then look at what we're up against in COVID. How about sustaining that knowledge, keeping up with change, keeping up with churn, keeping up with, right? So train, transfer, and sustain. And for so long, Con, even if whether we called learning or training, however we branded it, we really felt our domain, our deliverables, lived in that training journey of the 3 parts, right?
Right. And so as we look at the full responsibility that we have, and that is our responsibility is to ensure that people can perform effectively on the job.
Not know stuff.
Right. They need to know things in that, to make judgments and other things, but they've got to be able to perform effectively with the knowledge that they need to have around that performance. And so that requires us to step into the flow of work, and we need to intentionally facilitate that transition and that sustainment.
Yeah.
And that's exciting.
So let's ask you guys a question. We posed this out earlier. Think about your L&D team and your group. We'd love to see this in chat, or by all means, open your mic, raise your hand, and we'll open your mic, or you're allowed to, of course. And is your L&D team seen as a training department? Are they seen to own the training of train, transfer, sustain, or are they seen as a enabling organization, meaning one that targets transfer and sustain by those you serve, not by even your own department? How do you think we're seen, or you're seen right now by those you serve? Do they see you? Do they come to your office and say, I want 5 days of blah, 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 or I want 3 e-learnings on something? Or do they walk in and say, we got a performance problem, and I don't know how we're fixing it. I don't know. I don't necessarily want a class. I need your expertise in helping me do that. Bit of both, depends who you ask. I love that, Brenda. You will be trained.
Mainly trained.
Firmly entrenched. Combo of both, but more heavily on the train piece. primarily was seen as training organizations still. Yeah,
we've kind of created that actually.
right.
But we have a wonderful opportunity to shift that now as we talk about with the lines of business performance and enabling performance. But we've got to know how to take on that broader challenge and not have it swamp our ship, right? You're all busy, I know. And so when we talk about, well, it's not just train, it's transfer and sustain. The challenge is, where do I find the time to do that? And that requires us to do things differently.
It does.
It requires us to focus on performance first, on the sustainment and figuring out how to sustain performance and then backing into that training.
Yeah, I love the comments in chat. There's the, getting there, trying, right now, mostly training, but shifting. We call it shifting the mindset. Let's kind of go into our next theme, Con. There really are kind of two things that in our journey, friends, because semantics is one thing. I get it. And in some organizations, it gets down to the level of even what you call yourself. We know an organization that took the L out of L&D and became P&D, performance and development.
Yeah.
Right? They didn't call themselves instructional designers. They call themselves performance architects, performance consultants. Now, performance consultants is a tough one because that has some branding even outside of our domain, frankly. But the point is, it starts with semantics. It starts with how one. I wouldn't go to a dress store to buy a tie, right? Because the branding is all wrong. But here's the thing. Once I walk in the store, I got to find something different, right? So a couple of things Con and I talk about in enabling the shift, not just hoping for it, if you will. And again, branding's part of it. Number one is methodology. This is such. I've been in this business 29 years, Con a little longer.
Yeah. As you can see.
But you guys, I was steeped in ADDIE, if you know the acronym, ADDIE. And as I journeyed into this, when I first met this brilliant man back in my earlier days of my career, the first thing that hit me like a brick in the face when I saw him do what we call a rapid workflow analysis in the beginning of the design of the new deliverables we'll talk about in a moment. I couldn't help but sit in that room trying so hard just to fit the round peg I was watching being done in front of me with the square hole I knew as ADDIE. And I couldn't do it. And so here was the first aha for me. I had some retooling to do as a L&D professional. I had to learn a new approach. Now, the good news is it ain't all gone.
No.
Right?
No.
ADDIE's in there.
It is. It's all there. It's just we do it differently. We begin at the moment of apply. We focus on performance and we design for supporting people in the flow of work. And then we back into the training side of things.
As opposed in ADDIE, you're already thinking class.
Yeah.
You're already thinking lesson.
Yep.
Unit. You've got the form ahead of function. Right. Yep. And all we're talking about here. And when you get into the weeds, there's still the analysis part, task analysis, which I think we talked about task to a degree in ADDIE at times.
Yep.
Right. Knowledge. We talked about that. But the lens shifts from the very beginning when it's all about first understanding the workflow.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So methodology shift, number one. Number two, you guys, that I think is a really neat one is the deliverables. Right. I wrote an article years ago, and I posted it a couple of times on LinkedIn that says, do we teach swimming or prevent drowning? And it was based on a little story and moment I had as an undergrad in college. But the point was, when we sit down to do our analysis or sit down with our stakeholders, or someone walks into our office and wants us to build them something, what is the first thing they think we're going to make? And if you want to shift to performance first, the deliverables have to be performance-based. A classroom is not performance-based. It's a wonderful thing. It's in the train, transfer, sustain. We are not classroom bashers by any means. Targeted learning, we'll talk about that in a little bit, is a profound part of the methodology. But when I'm sitting down with a client now, friends, the last thing I'm thinking about is the classroom or an e-learning or a VILT. The first thing I'm thinking about is how do I prevent drowning for these performers once I understand the pool they're in, if I can run the metaphor to death here, meaning the workflow.
Yeah, and that shifts our view and interpretation of what learning really is.
It does.
Because in my early days, learning was about getting knowledge and having it stick, and as we focused on performance and the workflow, what I've come to understand is it's not about that. Some things you don't want to stick because of change.
Yeah.
You want to be able to get to the right information so that you can act in the right way with that information.
Yeah.
But what I've come to understand is that learning fundamentally is about the development of experience.
Mm.
The learning process really is where I have a learning experience, whether it's in the flow of work or out of the flow of work, and that triggers the recall of experience that I have, and that those experiences then integrate, in the process. I've shared the story before, and I think I shared it in our podcast. But when I had my heart valve replaced, they have to stop your heart, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they replace it with a valve from another animal, and then they start your heart again. And I really didn't want to know what classes my surgeons had taken. I wanted to know what their experience level was and how successful they were in that experience. That was my question. What is your experience? And in the real world, if he said, well, I've taken a lot of classes. I haven't done it yet.
Right. Well,
but I practiced on cadavers.
And, we've used that example in our work, and in the ebook that we wrote a while back and stuff, is this shift in the medical field of high study early to get those foundational, that's the train, but they intentionally, not happenstance, shift it to practice rounds, practicum as the content, because if they don't emerge with it high experience base, not high knowledge base, they're gonna maybe kill someone, frankly, right?
And so here's the beauty: as we build our performance solutions, and we extend our reach into the flow of work, where people are actually doing the work of the organization, they're learning while working, they're developing experience. In the real world, and that's so powerful.
So you guys, this again, we're part of what we're trying to challenge us here on, and us meaning Con and I too, in our work, because frankly, I'll be the first to admit, I do at times fight this every day because I'm so ingrained in my early experiences. Is that, do we think enablement first, or do we think knowledge first? I sound like I may be oversimplifying, but if your target is performance first, you will instinctively build performance deliverables first. You'll still build training support, training assets. But I used to think 5 days of something, and then if I had time, I'll make job aids. Now I think I'm making a digital coach, as we call it. I'm going to make a very elaborate, embedded, contextual, workflow-based, structured in workflow environment, and then I'm going to train what I gotta. Right? So there's a great question, Brian, you wrote in, many companies are talking about building a learning culture. Some say organizations compete at the speed of learning. I assume that this is a distraction. Is it ever a good thing? I guess where I think they can compete at the speed of change, not at the speed of learning.
So learning at the 5 moments of need. One of them is the moment of apply. If you see learning as what the performer is doing, as I perform in the world of work and gain experience, I'm learning. So it's your definition of learning. If learning is knowledge,
Sure.
then only.
And Brian, I think that's where I would argue that's where it would be a distraction. If it's one of my favorite quotes from a C-suite person, this was years ago, when this learning culture thing, Brian, was happening. He goes, one of the other people in the room, it was with senior leaders, and one of them said, yeah, we want a learning culture here. And I think very insightfully, another leader in the room went, no, we have a learning culture. It's just terrible. And every organization has a learning culture. I think it's just a part of the DNA. The question is, where your word distraction comes in, is what does it pivot on? If it pivots on enablement, if it pivots on the workflow, if it pivots on keeping people current with change, I don't think it's a distraction at all. I think it is that multiplier and the competitive. If it's knowledge based, if it's compliance based, if it's that kind of stuff, I would argue it's distraction.
Yeah. So we look at performing at the speed of change, right? That word performance, performers, performing is really powerful. So I learned to perform.
Yeah. And so let me ask you guys this question. This is question 2. And by all means, thank you, Jenna, in the chat. Please put questions there, or, we'd love to have you turn on your mic. Do you design for enablement? Do you, are your deliverables enable first, train second? Again, and by the way, second doesn't mean bad or that you're not still doing it. But how do you guys think about when you look at what you make? You'll be if back to the point about making a shift. If you keep making red coats, no one's going to ask you for blue pants, right? And so it comes down to the deliverable. If we want to change the perception of us, we have to go beyond words to what they know us for. What do you think? Historically, I've emphasized content. Look at you. Only now the penny is dropping about enablement. Excited to see the difference. I love that, Brian. Yeah. And by the way, I've ridden that pony, my friend. Again, this is my 39th year at this. 20 some of it was well embedded in content first. I remember back at conferences, they used to actually say content was king.
Yeah.
That was actually a tagline for conferences back in the 80s, 90s. Content is king. I'd argue context is king. Content is, is the enabler. Anyone else? What's your feeling around what you build? What you're allowed to build? Again, you're welcome to jump in and talk to us if you can. You there, Brian? I think you turned your mic off or on.
Yeah, I had a question about job aids, but it's premature. Perhaps let this roll for a while.
No, go, friend. Really, go with it. What's your question?
Well, my question, just starting to dabble in this area of enablement, you place a lot of emphasis on EPSS and so on. And my question is, does it always have to be digital, electronic, closely overlaid with the work process? Can it be a little more rudimentary, like a PDF or something with hyperlinks?
Look at you. Brian, we get asked this question all the time. And it's brilliant. It's my mom, who was a 35-year school teacher once, and I was in my early days of my journey. She instilled this on me because during one of my more frustrating times of my career, she said, although there will be revolutionary approaches and tools and methodologies in education, they will only ever be adopted in an evolutionary way. Right? Revolution versus evolution. And if I've learned anything in my 39 years is that learners and learning cultures do not like being revolutionized. It upsets the apple cart too much, frankly. So Brian, where I'm going with this is, my friend, although we emphasize EPSS, we emphasize digital coaches. Those are the Cadillac, I don't know what the right word is. Those are the more sophisticated deliverables in this domain. We know hundreds of organizations, literally, who started with linked PDFs, right? Who started with paper job aids.
There are design principles that you can apply across all kinds of platforms. even within print, within a PDF. And so there are some fundamental principles that we've learned about how to support people in the flow of work, but how you go about that, how you deliver that. There are lots of options.
And Brian, the exciting news is, my friend, and others, is that because of this evolution issue, you got time to do this well. Right. We've gone in guns a-blazing with a elaborate EPSS, and I mean a really good one. And because it was so contrary to the current learning environment, the horse bucked. They didn't. It was just too fat, too much, too quick, right? So part of the analysis is what we call a learning asset analysis, among others, and that's the beginning of understanding not just the workflow, but how people can and will and consume these enabling assets while they work. Right. And if we don't meet them where they are and evolve them into it, because there's some learning to learn here that has to go on.
Right.
Yeah, which takes us to our third area of discussion today, which is, people don't just by nature step into workflow learning and embrace, like you said, Bob, the tools and the solutions that we build. We have to teach them how to do that. We have to prepare them and bring them along. And so when you and I met each other in 1990, and
I was
you were very young.
8.
You were very young. I was old. But in that we were both teaching workshops, and those workshops were co-located. And one of the things that I learned from Bob at that time that I'd have him share with my class was a principle of ramp up, ramp down, training to independence. And I'd like you to share that.
Yeah.
I'm sure some of you have heard it, but this is a very important principle.
This is, and Chet, I want to get to yours because I love your chat, by the way. And those that didn't see it, take a gander at Chet's chat. I love where he's going with that. And I want to tackle that in a moment. But, again, if I may, friends, back to one of my heroes in my life, my mom. She also taught me, because I was having a rough. I taught 3rd grade for 5 years when I first started this journey, friends. I was an elementary school teacher, as we call it here in the States, and I was having a horrific time with fractions with my class. Couldn't do it. They just couldn't teach it that. They couldn't transfer. I didn't look at learning this way, by the way, back then, but they couldn't transfer my lessons to application. And my mom said, look, every teacher needs to understand that you're always teaching 2 things in the classroom, and in this order. Number 1, you're teaching content. You're trying to get knowledge, content, stuff across. But secondly, you are teaching your learners, enabling your learners to learn that content. There's the learn again, not us learn, them learn, and take it with them into the workflow, right? And so I was introduced to a word called metacognition, and another word called scaffolding. And what the principle behind those 2 things is that learners can be taught cognitively how to learn, not how to do fractions. That's the content. But surrounding that is the ability cognitively to tackle a problem in a systemic way, so that I pick it apart, diagnose it, use the resources around me that can help me solve it, and then come out better for it. Doesn't mean I don't fail. Doesn't mean I don't struggle, but I don't sit there and wait for someone to help me, right? That and then the idea of scaffolding means if you drive by a building that's getting built, when it's first starting, you have no idea what the structure is shaped. You see all the scaffolding up around it because it needs that support to get built. But as the building builds, friends, the scaffolding comes down. Why? Because the building can stand on its own. The principle in education is we ramp our students up in their ability to support themselves in their learning in an intentional, evolutionary way, while we back ourselves out of supporting them. when I used to observe trainers, you guys, back in those days, one of my big things I'd look for was what kind of questions are you asking and how are you answering questions at 4 o'clock versus 8 o'clock? At 8 o'clock, they were always very supportive. I'd answer questions with in completely, and by 4 o'clock, it's, well, what do you think the answer is? How would you find that answer? You've been taught that. How would you find that answer when you're back at your work if you have the same question? You see the difference in how I answered? That's ramp up and down, right? So one of the big things people fear about our methodology, friends, is that we're leaving learners hanging, that we're skipping stuff, right? We use something called critical skills analysis when we design targeted training. We intentionally, you guys, don't train on everything anymore on purpose. In fact, we train on half or less. Listen to that, half or less than what we used to on purpose. Why? Because when they get into the workflow, we have given them, Brian, linked PDFs or a beautiful digital coach. And by the way, in the classroom, they were taught how to use that so that when they get in the workflow, they can find stuff on their own. They can understand how to get to content that we may have skipped in the workflow where it's more powerful, right?
Yeah. We did a 2-year benchmarking effort on learning at the speed of change. Chet, there are lots of things that need to be in place for an organization to be able to adapt ahead of change organizationally. But I'll tell you this, you put in place a digital coach with the right change strategy,
right,
driving that. And you've taken a giant leap toward that adaptive capacity that organizations need to have.
Yeah, I think to your point, Chet, I think you had, there's change that comes at you that you can't anticipate, and you have to be reactive to it, clearly, right? Look at COVID. Holy cow, right? If you're an ER nurse right now, or God bless them, I mean, they don't know what variants coming next, right? So how do you get ahead of that? But science tries, right? And so there's learning done that we try to get ahead of change so that we frankly don't even maybe experience it, or when it comes, we've anticipated it. So I think there's support, Chet, and work that can be done there. But yes, there's change that comes at us unexpectedly, unanticipated. So what we want to enable our learners to do is, if I may, running with the COVID example, what a lot of doctors will say nowadays is that they're much better at the later waves because what they learned in the earlier ones. And even though they couldn't anticipate the next one, their ability to react quicker to it is right. And that's where, and we know hospitals, friends, that have used digital coaches to save lives. We literally know a hospital in the Netherlands and others that used an embedded digital coach on the ER floor, triaging patients, because there's no way to train those people out of this situation, right?
Here's a question for you to think about. Where is the skill of adaptiveness best learned? Adaptive response is a skill that organizations need every person in that organization to have that skill, the ability to adapt, to adjust, and all of that. And so it's not the classroom where you learn to be adaptive. The classroom does not train people in adaptiveness, but it's in the workflow.
Workflow does. Because
every time I do my job, complete a task, the situation is a little different.
Yep.
And with that difference, I learn how to adapt, and I have a tool, a digital coach, that can help me do that.
And guys, let me talk about one other thing. And yes, Louis, thank you. When you say digital coach, do you mean an EPSS or more human driven? Well, frankly, either, but yes, we mean an EPSS. And if I may, just real quick from a branding perspective, the reason we changed it from EPSS in our lexicon to digital coach is frankly, and this is important in your journey, you guys, is that nobody wanted an EPSS. nobody wanted an electronic performance support system, but every manager we talk to for their workers want them to have an embedded digital coach. Right?
Yeah, the key stakeholders seem to understand what that is.
Yeah.
And what it's going to do.
So let me tell you one other thing that is something that's I think super powerful about this that we also don't get. I always screw this word up, so help me. Self-efficacy.
Yeah.
Another thing of enabling that we have to think about is there's the operational side of enablement, but friends, what about the courageous side of enablement? What about the less risk averse side of enablement? I think too often, if I may, and I'll speak for myself, in the old days where I led with training, I created passive learners. They might have learned stuff and they might have left knowing things, and they probably left, I guarantee you they left doing things. But did I have them leave with the tools and the mentality that they could take themselves beyond what I taught them? Frankly, no. Right. And so I think the biggest blessing behind this whole thing is what we've seen this do to learners. And my goodness, friends, in COVID, people are beaten down. People are tired. People feel, this is tough. Right. And so an enablement strategy that not just enables them digitally, technically, instructionally, but one that enables them from a self-efficacy. I can do this. I can handle this. I can get out of this situation with the tools I've been taught to use is a misunderstood part of this journey.
Some of the most significant research that's been conducted in the realm of self-efficacy was conducted by Al Bandura at Stanford University. And what he found is that if people make a mistake, that if they can recover quickly, i.e. the moment is solved, if they can recover quickly, it increases their confidence in their self-efficacy. Or the minute that they step from training or whatever, teaching, instruction into the world of the real world of work, and they perform effectively, they do it, that increases self-efficacy more so than anything else. And so a digital coach helps in both of those.
Yeah, well, Garth is actually I love the workflow learning concept. The classroom training is no risk of failure to the business, right? Because they're out of the workflow, right? How do you reduce that risk here's the answer, Garth, to this, I think, is that it's not the risk of failure. It's the risk of the consequence of failure. Those are two different things, right? One of our colleagues says that there's trial and error in the workflow. We want to eliminate that. I would argue you can't ever eliminate trial, but I want to mitigate error.
Significant to catastrophic error,
right?
If it's error where people can learn from that error,
yes,
and the organization can recover, and the consequences are not significant, that's very powerful. An error then becomes a very powerful learning moment. But it's where the consequences of failure are significant to catastrophic that we have to address that. And that's a game changer, folks, because we find that about half of the performance can be pushed in the workflow. If people make a mistake, there's a recovery,
right? A
rapid recovery.
So I guess my point, Garth, is that to believe we can get rid of risk and failure is not what we should chase because we can't. What we want to do is minimize it. We want to optimize when it happens, so that if they efficiently get back to work. We want to use the classroom, the valuable time of the classroom, for teaching those high critical failure things that we might be able to eliminate those, but allow the things that are not as devastating to still frankly occur, but not throw them without a life raft here, but because of the digital coaching stuff, they can quickly get themselves out of error and back to work. That's what we're going for here in the methodology.
We have to know where error is high risk. And so it's not about how frequently somebody does something or how complex it is. Those are okay. But what we've learned is that it's about the critical impact of failure. And you want to know that in the flow.
So last thing, friends, and we're getting close. My goodness. Sorry about this. You've even spoken about building a business case. Yep. Around a performance enablement project. Can you explain on this? Yeah. So guys, you got to get started somewhere. One thing you'll hear us talk about is that you can spin this puppy forever. I used to. I've got like 100 decks, PowerPoints that explain this every which way to Sunday. But eventually you gotta dip your toe in the water here. And so what we recommend, Brian, is that you find, and we've got other things in our 5 Moments of Need website and things that help you with, gives you some guidelines around starting this, but you got to build a business case around performance outcomes, business measurements, KPIs, and pick that first place to start, because showing is going to win the day. So you have to have something, but picking that first project is really important, because you're going to fail. You're going to learn while doing. We are going to learn while doing. Your organization has to change that learning culture thing we talked about. And so going after the elephant may not be the first place to start, but because if I fail there, it's too devastating. So being selective about your early wins eventually wins the war, if that makes any kind of sense. So friends, my gosh, it is 11:44. So, hey, we sure hope this was helpful. We hope the format was okay. And we rambled on like we always do. Sorry about that, but you guys were terrific in chat. We'd like to try this again. We'd like to get better at it. We're going to continue to podcast, blog, and otherwise. Let's keep the conversation going. Let us know what you think about stuff. Help us know what our next quarter's session like this should be about, because we want to share in the dialogue and the learning and the experience around doing this. We are recording this. We'll send it out to you for your viewing and listening pleasure. And thanks for being with us on this journey, friends. We couldn't do it without you. Be safe, be well. Bye now.